Hi, everybody. This is Beth, your instructor again, reporting from North Lake College to talk about Chapter 5 and ethnicity. We've talked a lot about the difference between multiculturalism and assimilation, and Chapter 5 takes that kind of a step further. So as a reminder, assimilation required different ethnic groups to give up some of who they were, their traditions, part of their culture to become more American. And as we've learned over the last many years, as immigration has been on the rise in the United States, that we've shifted to a more multicultural model, meaning that immigrants and various ethnic groups are allowed to be American, but still keep their identities that belong to them from their different ethnic groups. And so our textbook kind of talks about that there's been a shift in the way Americans behave. And that is that Americans that have an ethnic background other than the United States are more likely to identify themselves in more than just one way. So if you ask, what is your ethnicity, they're likely to say, I'm American and Hispanic, or I'm Mexican American, for example, as opposed to just identifying themselves as Hispanic. So much so that if you look at this week's discussion, you'll see that in the year 2000, the U.S. Census had to change. That was the first time that when people took the census, they were able to select more than one ethnicity. So people that were African American can go a little bit further and explain where they're from originally. If you're Hispanic, you can be more specific and be from Puerto Rico or Cuba, for example. So that really just reflects that shift in thinking from a more assimilistic society to one that is more multicultural. And if you'll look around, you'll see that multicultural society is reflected in so many things we do. For example, you'll see a lot of ethnic festivals, the Greek Food Festival, for example, which is happening this weekend. Shameless plug. But it's really a good opportunity for everyone to be American, but kind of show a little bit of that heritage as well. And our book kind of talks about an interesting phenomenon that certain ethnic foods, for example, tacos and pasta, are so mainstream American food now that we really don't think of them as ethnic. So that sort of ethnic part of those foods have kind of faded away a little bit. But I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things I've noticed just with my own students, for example. I have students from all over the world, as you have heard me say before. And I have a couple of students that are Indian in background. When I say India, I mean from India, not Native Americans. I have one who is actually from Africa, Tanzania, but is Indian, and another who was raised in the United States from two Indian parents who immigrated here as college students. One family, my student who was born here, they're a lot more forward thinking. His parents don't expect him to marry an Indian woman. They appreciate their culture, but not to the exclusion of the American culture. My other student, who is from Africa, it's quite the opposite. Her parents are very traditional Indian parents and very much expect her to marry within their religion and culture. And my student, who is quite American, for example, has been not really dating, but corresponding with a young Indian woman who is, I think, still in high school, in many states away, and texting and making phone calls. And unfortunately, this young woman's father called my student and asked him to no longer correspond with his daughter. He had a very difficult time understanding why this was. And so we had a good conversation about what happens when you're, let's say, from India. Maybe you're born in India, and you come to the United States, and you live here as an American with an Indian background. But your children, who are born in this country, may choose to marry outside your ethnicity, so that every generation that goes by is less Indian or less Hispanic. And so in having that conversation a little bit, my other students said, yes, that's exactly what my parents are afraid of. They love living in America, but they still want us to be Indian. They want their grandchildren to be Indian and not necessarily American. So it's kind of representative of, this, of sort of the struggle that people have when they come here. Each generation is a little bit more American and clashes with that generation before. So I thought that was a pretty good example of what a lot of our folks actually experience. And within my own family, my father was actually had an arranged marriage that he chose to not to do. He married somebody else, and that tends to cause a lot of strife in families, even in this day and age. So one of the things that you'll also see for this week is a little bit about what's the downside, if there is such a thing, of multiculturalism and large-scale immigration. You'll see there's an article and there's a YouTube video. Yes, it's a little long, I apologize, from a man who is an economist, and he talks really not, I don't think, in a racist way, but he talks about the economic impact of immigrants in the United States. And he speaks very specifically about immigrants who come with low-wage jobs that tend to drive down the wages for those that are American workers. And he speaks very much of immigrants and their identity as Americans, and says that research suggests and actually backs up that immigrants, even though they live here and are happy to live in the United States, are not as American, and they don't pledge allegiance to the United States as much. So that their allegiance is still with their home country, or allegiance in and of itself is not as important. So he makes the argument that if we're going to have welfare, or we're going to be giving jobs to immigrants, legal or not, that we should be focused on Americans, because they're the ones that are really allied with this country to begin with. So I thought that was an interesting argument, and it kind of leads me to the next part. I will not spend a lot of time going over all the definitions. This chapter has a lot of definitions that I'm sure most of you have heard of. Racism, discrimination, stereotypes, which is part of your paper, and an important one. And they go so far as to talk about oppression. So it's important, as we talk about those kinds of things, that you frame it in a question. So is our gentleman that feels that there's a negative impact for Americans because of immigration, is that racism? It's a question to really ask yourself and to ponder. One of last week's YouTube videos, which is framed in information about immigration, as you probably saw, really turned into a very anti-immigrant statement. So bear in mind, as you look at some of these things and you read them and watch them, what resonates with you? What do you think is racism? Is it wrong for white Europeans to feel that they should remain dominant? And as you'll see in your textbook, you'll see that there's been a huge shift in the majority in this country, that there are many actually larger cities that have already shifted to majority minority. In other words, for example, Hispanics outnumber whites in the makeup of the city. Texas is a great example of that. And so my question that I want to leave you with is immigration a good thing? And what impact has immigration had on our identities as Americans, or identities, our ethnic identities in our background? So as you answer this week's discussion posts, think about that and think specifically about how you identify yourself. Thank you, everybody, and I'll talk to you again for Chapter 6.